Hi, this is Dr. Setka, and in this presentation, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of American literary modernism and walk you through some close readings of several of the poems assigned for this week. If you haven't already, I recommend that you stop the video now and go back and read the Norton Introduction to Volume D, which is the section on modernism, as it provides a comprehensive overview of the cultural and historical factors that influenced the development of modernism. So, modernists believed, first and foremost, that reality was subjective. They believed that truth does not exist objectively, but is rather the product of the mind's interaction with reality. And this is why we see so many first-person or limited points of view in modernist works. The selected point of view is often that of a naive or marginal person. So think of Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, for example, an outsider, whose point of view conveys the reality of confusion and dissent rather than reinforces the myth of certainty and consensus. So this is a real breakaway from literary realism. Modernists also believed that it was their duty to represent human psychology. So they're being greatly influenced by Freudian theory of the human mind, right? So this is why we get so much stream of consciousness in both modernist poetry and fiction. Just as they are making an effort to paint a portrait, if you will, of the human mind, they're also seeking to convey through literature the sense of fragmentation and incoherence of modernity as they're experiencing it. As the Norton intro explains quite well, the world at this point is in a great state of flux, right? We've moved from kind of quasi-chivalric ideas of how individuals and nations should interact and behave to the conflagration of World War I, where it's mechanized warfare and all-out bloodshed. There are all kinds of quasi-liberations taking place. So you see the suffragette movement with women getting the right to vote in Western nations, including the United States, right? So there are greater freedoms, but with these freedoms comes kind of a chaos and a sense of being unmoored. But perhaps most importantly, the modernists propose that if meaning is a human construct, then meaning cannot be separated from the process of its making, which is why we have so many self-reflexive works when we look at modernist literature. By this, I mean these are works that are concerned with their own nature as art and with their own questioning of previous traditions of literature. So there are many, many allusions in modernist text to antiquity, to the classics, to kind of the literary tradition as a whole up to this point. Another key characteristic of modernism is ambiguity and open endings. I always like to joke that if you walk away from a modernist poem feeling confused, that's kind of the point. These works, I think, are very much constructed with open-endedness in mind. Connected to that is a rejection of linearity. So in works of fiction, we have kind of a rejection or moving away from linear plots. And in poetry, we have a disavowal of traditional poetic forms. In both poetry and prose, we see wordplay being privileged. So words themselves become a subject for poetic inquiry. We also see a desire for directness, compression, and vividness, and this often leads to shorter works of both poetry and fiction. So it's no accident that the short story as a form gains great popularity in this period. The fiction produced privileges suggestion over detail. So we're not getting those really intense, detailed passages about what someone wore, what they looked like. It's much more impressionistic. As Willa Cather suggested in her essay about novel writing, which we'll read alongside The Great Gatsby, she believed that novelists should throw all the furniture out of the window, all the tiresome old patterns, leaving the scene bare for the play of emotions. So again, I think the word impressionistic is really important here. You're kind of left with a sense, a feeling, rather than a concrete description. An offshoot of modernism that is highlighted in the selections for this week is imagism. So this was a subgenre of modernism that was concerned with creating clear imagery with sharp language. So the essential idea was to recreate the physical experience of an object through words. As with all of modernism, imagism implicitly rejected Victorian or, late 19th century models of poetry, which tended toward narrative and storytelling. And in this way, imagist poetry is similar to the Japanese haiku. Both are brief renderings of some sort of poetic scene. Here on the right-hand side of the slide, we have Ezra Pound's annotated copy of James Leahy's translation of the Book of Poetry, Xie Qing, as published in the Sacred Books of the East. Right, so he's like really engaging with the form of the Chinese characters. So Pound, who looks very hipsterish in this image, was a towering figure of modernism and a great propagator of imagism. He defined image as an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. And he believed, and this is really important, he believed that imagism could reframe, revive, and re-energize language. An imagist poem encapsulates a poetic impulse in the most time and space efficient way possible. It's like a kernel of poetry. Pound himself was influenced by Chinese poetry thanks to Ernest Fenollosa's essay on the Chinese written character. In this work, Fenollosa observes that certain Chinese characters look like the idea they expressed. So the character for sun looks like a sun. The character for tree looks like a tree. So for Pound, likewise, the words of the poet should evoke the very physical object that he is writing about. In an interview in Poetry magazine published in 1913, Pound delineated the following principles of imagism. So he said, it is the direct treatment of thing, whether subjective or objective. It's to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. And as regarding rhythm, imagists should compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of the metronome. And by this he means we need to abandon the confines of poetic meter and rhyme scheme. Pound later expanded on these principles in the preface to Des Imagistes, and I apologize for my horrible French pronunciation. This was an anthology of imagist poetry, in which he listed what he called the essentials of imagism. And I've kind of just distilled it here to its main points. So 1, to use the language of common speech, but always the exact word. Not the merely exact, not the merely decorative. So we're getting rid of all fluff. right? We don't need to dress up language. We just need the word that communicates the essence of the thing. We need to create new rhythms, he says, as the expression of new moods, and not to copy old rhythms, which merely echo old moods. This is kind of where we get the adage, make it new. We do not insist upon free verse as the only method of writing poetry, he goes on to say. But again, the idea is to be original, make it new, approach the representation of things in a new and radical way. Third, to allow absolute freedom in the choice of subject. So in other words, write about whatever you want. It just has to be authentic. 4, to present an image, hence the name Imagist. He writes, we are not a school of painters, but we believe that poetry should render particulars exactly and not deal in vague generalities. And the reference to visual art here is very deliberate. Imagists are using words to create images. At the same time that poets like Pound and Eliot are working with language in this way, they're very much inspired by modernist art, which we'll talk more about when we get to William Carlos Williams. 5, to produce poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred or indefinite. So again, precision is the aim. And finally, most of us believe that concentration is of the very essence of poetry. So again, distilling a thing to its very essence, to its very thingness, if you will. An often anthologized example of a short Imagist poem is Pound's In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The poem presents two images directly side by side. No verb is needed for this presentation, so therefore no verb occurs. The rhythm of the first line is mostly, but not mechanically, iambic. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Line 2 hammers its point home with the 3 accented words at the close. Wet, black, bough. With only 14 words, it's clear that each word in this poem was chosen specifically for its imagistic properties. For example, the word apparition in the first line suggests the nature of traveling in a crowd. It is a fleeting action, so much so that the people seem like ghosts to the observer. In one moment, there is a face as clear as can be, and in the next, it's gone and likely will never be remembered by the mind. They are apparitions in one place for one moment and then gone forever in the next. In the second line, the viewer observes petals on a wet black bough, which is to say they are looking at the leaves of a tree, likely following rainfall. In this image, the reader is presented with the idea of small, fleeting, and weak elements of beauty within the natural world. It's difficult to describe the feeling of appreciation of a transient natural phenomenon, which is likely why Pound chose this particular image to stand in for a feeling that can't be easily described. The first image in a station of the metro is entirely constructed by humans, and the second one is entirely a phenomenon of the natural world. The relationship between the two ideas is an abstract one, but by pairing them together, Pound seems to be suggesting that there is that specific kind of beauty in the station of a metro, and that the fleeting apparitions of people drifting through is no different than the wilting nature of a petal stuck to a wet tree. The petal weathers, the petal is rained on, and eventually that petal wilts and dies, just like each person entering and leaving the view of the author. Now, Pound would eventually go on to break away from the confines of Imagism, but this poem remains one of the finest examples of the movement. With the work of T.S. Eliot, we see the influence of Freudian theory at work. Like Pound's work, Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock felt radically new to readers at the time. It's cryptic and open to multiple interpretations. We see this in the opening lines. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Now, the poem never clarifies who you and I are. They may be Prufrock and the reader, or they may be Prufrock and an unknown interlocutor. The first metaphor is really unsettling. How can evening be compared to an etherized patient? The automatic association of these two images in Eliot's poem, like the free associations of one of Freud's patients during a therapy session, suggests a person entirely disconnected from their surroundings. Together with the succeeding stanzas, which project dissociated scenes of a future encounter with a person the poem names only as one, the poem seems hallucinatory, only half clear. This effect is paradoxically augmented by the wit of the lines, many of which have entered the common lexicon. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. My favorite, I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. And my dad's current favorite, I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. The musicality and suppleness of Eliot's rhymes, the intriguing, incompletely revealed dramatic situation, and the profusion of details like teas and cakes and ices bring readers inexorably into participating in Prufrock's dilemma. Like Prufrock, the reader feels alienated, puzzled, and incomplete. That brings us to Gertrude Stein. Stein famously believed in the idea of word energy, and her experimentation with language is perhaps even more radical than that of Pound and Eliot. In her work, she renders language strange and forces us to be acutely aware of the ways that language works. Here, for example, is the first of the objects in Tender Buttons, titled A Carafe That Is a Blind Glass. A kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and an arrangement in a system to pointing. All this and not ordinary, not unordered in not resembling. The difference is spreading. Stein herself insisted that Tender Buttons was entirely realistic in the tradition of Gustave Flaubert. I used to take objects on a table, like a tumbler or any kind of object, and try to get the picture of it clear and separate in my mind and create a word relationship between the word and the things seen, she recalled in a 1946 interview. What she no doubt means is that reference remains central to her project, even if representation does not. Unlike Eliot and Pound, she does not give us an image, however fractured, of a carafe on a table. Rather, she forces us to reconsider how language actually constructs the world we know. A carafe is, of course, a kind in glass, a kind of object belonging to the glass family, which includes its cousins, like bottles, pitchers, jugs, tumblers, wine glasses, and so forth. A carafe is a blind glass, presumably because it is filled with red wine or sherry or port, and as a result, you can't see through it. It is also a blind glass because it doesn't mirror the spectator. Nor can a carafe be used like a pair of glasses to look at anything. One looks at it and through it, a spectacle, but it does not improve our vision in any way. Nothing strange there. The single hurt color probably refers to the wine, red being traditionally associated with hurt. But hurt may also refer to some sort of contamination. perhaps something like soda water, has bled into that pure color and changed it. At the same time, the carafe participates in what Stein calls an arrangement in a system to pointing. A compositional arrangement like that of the Cubist paintings Stein loved, in which each thing is related to every other thing. An arrangement that, in Stein's lexicon, is called grammar. The carafe, in any case, is not ordinary. That is, it's not just a pitcher or, something that holds a liquid. Not unordered and not resembling. It is distinct from all its cousins, but they are all part of the compositional system. And Stein concludes with the curiously postmodern assertion, the difference is spreading. No two instances are ever identical. Even when the same phrase is repeated over and over again, as is common in Stein's work, there is always a difference. And such not resembling enlists the reader's participation in the text's linguistic differential play. One noted admirer of Stein's experimentation was William Carlos Williams, whose poetry is among my favorites. Specifically, Williams was drawn to Stein's work because of the way that she sought to break language free of its conceptual framework. In an essay, he wrote, "Gertrude Stein has gone systematically to work smashing every connotation that words have ever had in order to get them back clean. It can't be helped that it's been forgotten what words are made for. It can't be helped that the whole house has to come down. In fact, the whole house has to come down, and it's got to come down because it has to be rebuilt. And it has to be rebuilt by unbound thinking. And unbound thinking has to be done with straight, sharp words." Famously, Williams summed up his philosophy of poetry by declaring that there are no ideas but in things. What he meant by this was that things mark the limit of ideas. And when we consider things in all of their thingness and all of their relationships, we can begin to eliminate generalities. But above all, it was the visual artists of the period who helped Williams discover a technique to achieve this unbound thinking. Williams visited the Armory Show of 1913, where works by Cézanne, Gauguin, Matisse, Picasso, Braque, and Duchamp were first seen by the American public. These experiences with the new art coming from Europe had a tremendous impact on Williams. In his autobiography, Williams later recalled his sense of liberation at seeing Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. "I do remember how I laughed out loud when I first saw it, happy with relief." In a poem of this period, "The Rose is Obsolete," Williams shows these influences at work. The poem is based on a collage by Cubist painter Juan Gris, where the roses are actually photographs cut out from a flower catalog and pasted in. I couldn't find an image of this collage online, but this is another one of Gris's collages titled Flowers. So Williams' poem tries to capture some of the tactile and dynamic quality of this kind of collage while asserting its own theme. The rose is obsolete, but each petal ends in an edge, the double facet cementing the grooved columns of air. The edge cuts without cutting, meets nothing, renews itself in metal or porcelain. Whither? It ends. But if it ends, the start is begun, so that to engage roses becomes a geometry. Sharper, neater, more cutting, figured in Maiolica. The broken plate glazed with a rose. Somewhere the sense makes copper roses steel roses. The rose carried weight of love, but love is at an end of roses. It is at the edge of the petal that love waits, crisp, worked to defeat laboredness. Fragile, plucked, moist, half-raised, cold, precise, touching. What? The place between the petal's edge and from the petal's edge a line starts. That being of steel, infinitely fine, infinitely rigid, penetrates the Milky Way without contact, lifting from it, neither hanging nor pushing. The fragility of the flower, unbruised, penetrates space. As a symbol, the poem tells us, the rose is obsolete. And yet, in this very rejection of its previous meaning lies the possibility for a revisioning. The poem invites us to see this object not for what it symbolizes, but for what it is, a dynamic center of potential meaning, radiating lines of force. Taken out of its familiar context, stripped of its traditional associations, and viewed in terms of its essential form, the rose can now be kind of reconstituted in the virtual space of the imagination. As form, it has edges which cut without cutting, providing new surfaces for imaginative contact. And its significance is only to be determined at these points of contact with the reader-viewer. It is at the edge of the petal that love waits, crisp, worked to defeat laboredness. Instead of relying on convention or sentiment, this new way of seeing requires a geometry of the mind, a process which leads to unexpected connections. From the petal's edge, a line starts. That being of steel, infinitely fine, infinitely rigid, penetrates the Milky Way without contact, lifting from it, neither hanging nor pushing. The fragility of the flower, unbruised, penetrates space. Despite the transformation of this natural form into the rigid, inorganic forms of art, the rose's essence remains unbruised. Imbued with a power that penetrates space, the rose, as now perceived, promises a new union of the world and the imagination. Thus, by the end of the poem, the rose, contrary to the poem's initial claim, is no longer obsolete. Renewed in the imagination through art, it now radiates lines of force powerful enough to transfix the universe and us as the reader in the process. The rose, however, is not just a defense of modernist techniques. This poem is also an argument about the power and value of the imagination to renew our vision of the natural world. Though the artist must first destroy the previous forms, his breakup of the object provides the possibility for a breakthrough in perception. The work of art creates new edges, new potential points of contact, multiple perspectives, assuring that the object will remain capable of revealing unsuspected beauty and that truth will never be fixed in a single meaning. And we see this technique at work in the poem itself. So in this poem, The Rose is Obsolete, the syntax is broken up so that the words themselves are freed to form new associations. In these places, lines such as love is at an end of roses, or even more disconcerting, it is at the edge of the poem frustrates our expectations. For Williams, the highest imaginative act is thus to see something freshly and in response to make something new. That concludes this brief introduction to high modernist poetry. I hope you enjoy the other poems that I've assigned, as well as the foray into Harlem Renaissance poetry, which I much prefer. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.